All right, sir. Well, thank you so much for taking your time. I really appreciate it. So let's just hop right into it. My first question is, how important is religion in everyday American life?
For me, we are built as a Christian foundation as a country. And for us, most of our moral structures, even our common law, goes back to a Judeo-Christian ethic. And that has been the foundation of great communities and for great countries for thousands of years. And it is really going to be an interesting question on, as we move away from those traditions, move away from those values, what kind of country are we ultimately going to be?
Now, we see today the removal of so much of God in society, whether it's monuments or even in schools. A lot of people are even starting to say that, no, this wasn't founded as a Christian nation. Those men were not Christians, they were deists. What do you think about that, and do you have anything to say?
Ultimately, when you look at the foundation of our country, it clearly is from a Judeo-Christian heritage. Oftentimes, people will look to Thomas Jefferson and say, well, Thomas Jefferson had doubts and he wasn't a Christian in the form of maybe Adams or George Washington. But still, when you read through Thomas Jefferson's writings, it's very clear that he had a personal relationship with God. But you back up and start looking at John Adams. John Adams was a dynamic Christian, an unapologetic Christian in his walk, in his daily life, in his politics, along with George Washington. Washington was a dynamic Christian as well.
So all those men were obviously involved in public life, and obviously it was 300 years ago. But you also, as a senator, are involved with politics in the United States. How much do you see an influence in your line of work? Do you see a Christian influence with different people you work with, or have you seen it change, let's just say, in the past 20 years?
I've been in the General Assembly of Virginia for 25 years, and certainly there has been a very dramatic change away from the formal recognition of God in our society. And I think as a society, we've certainly paid a price for that. I mean, you've seen the traditional family really kind of just fall apart in many ways. You've seen the very definition of what marriage is. You've seen the elevation of crime and other items in a society. And so I think that as the further we get removed from God in our society, the further we remove ourselves from our heritage, of our Judeo-Christian heritage, really the worse the society is ultimately going to be, because we've lost that connection. Our forefathers told us that this experiment in democracy would probably only work if we were a Christian nation.
So what do you think, as a public official, you need to do? Obviously, you have a voice that people will be able to hear. What do you think people if they're in Congress, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, what do you think they need to do to keep this idea of a Christian nation?
Right. One of the great measures in the United States has always been our measure of tolerance, right? There are people that don't believe in God at all. There are people that have a very variety of faiths, and we have always, as a country, respected those individuals. But it's really quite unfortunate that we've seen a divorcing ourselves from our true history, that we've seen a divorcing ourselves from really our true traditions that we've had because of a desire to make sure that we are all things to all people. So to me, in my 25 years, I've certainly seen a pretty big movement away from God in the public square, and I think that has really inured to our detriment. We really do not have that grounding effect that comes with a Judeo-Christian ethic.
Now, you talked about, the United States has always been considered a melting pot for different people, different religions, different ethnic backgrounds,
Sure.
and people have always brought up the conversation of separation of church and state. Do you still think that's important for someone?
Sure.
Obviously, not everyone has the beliefs, not everyone follows the Judeo-Christian values. Do you think that it's important to respect those, but still respect the values that comes from
Right.
a religion like Christianity?
You know, for 200 plus years, we had separation of church and state in a form that says that we didn't have the Church of England. We didn't have a religion that someone was required to pledge allegiance to. We had freedom of religion. Back in Virginia, it was a founding document, that document on the freedom of religion, and it's embedded in our Constitution. But also, it doesn't mean that government is free from all religious tendencies and all religious involvement. And that's where I think that we've gone wrong. We've made sure that we protected religious liberty, but in the most recent years, that has been reinterpreted as we have got to remove God from our society in every place. And that, I think, is what's so detrimental.
Why do you think in modern times there's been such a large group of people trying to remove anything that has God on it, whether it's the dollar, whether it's the Pledge of Allegiance? Why do you think we've seen a rise in the past, I would say 30 years especially, of this movement of just trying to get Christianity or religion in itself out of American life?
Well, you know, I think it really ended up cascading as a result of the Supreme Court decision that really removed prayer from our schools. It wasn't that you could force an individual to pray before. We never have done that, because you have people of Jewish faith or the Muslim faith that clearly have their own views. But when you started saying that we really need to remove God from our public square, remove God from our schools, you really saw a dramatic change. And really the generations that have followed on those decisions have followed through with those decisions, and they have taken it to the next step, which is removing God from the money is a big item, making sure that the statues and those things that represent our history are wiped away, that we, in many cases, rewrite history. And that's really, really troubling. We have a great history. We have a great tradition, and Judeo-Christian tradition that is embedded in our society.
Do you think it's important, I'm a college student, that we are taught, there's this whole debate with openness and being open-minded in college, and we've seen whether the right or the left try to hinder that and try to say, hey, I don't want to listen to the other side. I think Liberty University's done a great job in opening both sides. But do you think it's important to, even on a left-leaning college, to try to not necessarily teach those values, but have college students try to learn and understand both the benefits of those values?
Right. You know, it used to be that the left in this country was certainly not in favor of God, but they were in favor of free speech. So we could hear all points of view, and especially schools like Berkeley, there were demonstrations, and properly so, to make sure that free speech existed on college campuses. And now that's gone. Really what you see is you have the new religion of the left, or new religion of the environment, takes over. And it also comes with it a very much an intolerance for anything that's related to God, anything that's related to a more conservative perspective. And I really think those kids that are going through that process are really missing out on the great history of Berkeley and other colleges that push for these rights, and these individuals are taking those rights and really stamping on them for the new religion of the left.
My last question for you, what do you want to see, or what do you think America is going to look like 20 years from now?
I think that the country will be what it is on its knees before God. And so really the decision on what this country ultimately will be in the hands of college students like yourself, or people like yourself who really have the capability of changing this country. We've had a very strong left-leaning pendulum move over the last 20 years. But it's going to be up to a new generation of Americans to determine what is the country going to look like. And they can do it. And just as sure as the change has taken us far to the left and away from God, a pendulum can move back to the right and back toward God. And that's really up to the next generation to determine the future of the country.